Hi, I'm Eugene, and I'm one of the High Rock pastors. This Lenten season, we've been in a series meditating on Jesus' final words as he hung on the cross. And we experimented with different titles for this series, including Last Words, Words from the Cross, and my favorite, Crosswords. But we thought that might be a little too clever for a series reflecting on Jesus' suffering. And speaking of suffering, today we'll be contemplating what is perhaps the lowest, darkest point of Christ's entire life on earth. Having been abandoned by his closest friends, tortured and ridiculed, and near death, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is Christ at his weakest and most vulnerable. Christ at his most human. I don't need to ask whether you've ever felt this way. Most of us have at one point or another felt abandoned and alone, like God has left the building. Perhaps it was a tragedy or the loss of a loved one. Perhaps it was an injury or illness or frightening diagnosis. Perhaps it was a disappointment or failure, a heartbreak, or not getting the job you wanted or the school you wanted to get into. Perhaps it was an experience of injustice or unfairness, or a betrayal by a friend or someone you loved, or a persistent longing unfulfilled, a broken dream, a dark depression. Some of you know that I grew up in the New York City area, but for various reasons, by the time I reached high school, my parents moved my father's business to South Korea. And this meant that I was left all alone as a teenager for months at a time, with only my sister as a guardian who just started college herself. And what happens when you leave a teenager by himself with virtually zero parental guidance? In my instance, nothing good. I was too young to process the alienation and abandonment I was feeling. And so it shouldn't have surprised anyone when I started cutting school. I ended up not going to any classes for my entire sophomore year. I went to school, but I just hung out with my friends all day until it was time to go home. Once, just for fun, I decided to actually go to homeroom, and I sat there while my homeroom teacher called my name for attendance. Eugene Kim, Eugene Kim, and the whole class thought it was pretty funny that he had no idea I was sitting right in front of him. Well, eventually, my parents found out. And when I say eventually, I mean it was already the end of the school year. It was way too late to do anything about it, so they gave me a choice. Option A, stay in New York and most likely continue down this path to nowhere. But at least I could be with my friends, who at the time meant everything to me. Or option B, leave everything behind. Move to Korea with my parents. I mean, I would have to repeat some school, but it would be a fresh start. One thing to understand is that even though I was truant, having grown up in church, I still had faith and a relationship with God at this time. And my conversations with God went something like this. God, I know I messed things up, but I still believe you have a plan for my life. If I leave all my friends and everything I've ever known and move to Korea, you have to meet me there. You have to show up big time. God, you cannot leave me alone. Not again. If I take this leap of faith, you better be there to catch me. And it was then that I joined a K-pop boy band. No, that never happened. It's just a rumor. When I arrived in Korea that summer, I was not at all prepared for how much I would miss my friends, who were the only real source of connection I had. I was not prepared for the language barrier, the culture shock, the loneliness. I spent hours each day lying in bed, depressed and angry. How could God let me down like this? God, why have you forsaken me? So do you know what I did? God left me, so I left God. Maybe you can remember a time when you felt like God let you down. Maybe you're in a time like that right now. Maybe you feel angry or distant from God. Maybe there is a sadness in your life, and you wonder, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? It's a legitimate question. And we want to know God's response. And today we're going to look at the moment when Jesus asked that question himself. In the passage that was just read for us, we see Jesus crucified between two criminals. And in order to fully appreciate what's happening, we have to understand that crucifixion was far more than just about physical torture and death. It was designed to inflict maximum humiliation and shame. See, the Jews in Jesus' day were an extremely modest people. So modest that even their version of an undergarment was a tunic that covered most of the body down to the knees. Yet, if someone were only wearing their undergarment in public, they would be considered naked. Nakedness was considered shameful. And despite the way most crucifixions are depicted in art with Jesus covered by a loincloth, most sources suggest that victims of crucifixion were stripped completely naked. You can imagine how humiliating and vulnerable that would be in our day. Now multiply that tenfold. It was the ultimate public humiliation, hung on a cross, a gruesome spectacle for all to see, exposed and disgraced. Mark tells us those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross, save yourself." The chief priests and teachers of the law joined in mocking him. He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down from the cross that we may see and believe. Mark is building the tension here. Everyone has already left and abandoned him. Now it comes down to one final question. Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, the Son of God. He claimed that he was sent by God. Now is the time to prove it. Jesus is about to die. Everyone is mocking and ridiculing him. Will God come through or not? Is he who he said he is or not? And there's a part of us that wants to say, "Come on, Jesus, save yourself. What are you doing? Just call down a few legions of angels already. Do something. Show them who you are." Maybe I've watched too many superhero movies, but this is the part in the movie when Jesus is supposed to make his comeback. He's supposed to break the cross with his arms and vaporize the bad guys. He's supposed to jump off the cross and into an awesome superhero landing. As everyone is waiting to see what will happen, they finally see him straining to take in enough air to say something. And you're thinking, this is it. He's going to let him have it. He who commanded waves to be still and raised the dead is about to speak. And Jesus cries out in a loud voice, Elohi, Elohi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? What? No, forsaken. How can this be? Those who heard him thought he was crying out to Elijah to come deliver him. So they said, let's leave him alone and see if Elijah will come and take him down. Maybe this is his last chance. Maybe Elijah will descend in a chariot of fire and rescue Jesus. But instead, Jesus cries out one last time and just dies. We know the story doesn't end there. But in this moment, we have to wonder what's going on and why. Why doesn't Jesus say something like, you all just wait and see, or I'll be back? Instead, he says the worst possible thing to let your enemies hear you say in this moment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why would he say that of all things? Why would he admit to such despair and weakness? Why would he be so vulnerable when he's surrounded by his enemies? It makes no sense. Maybe we like to see Jesus as kind of a cool, tough guy. We're naturally drawn to a triumphant Jesus who will defeat our enemies and fight our battles and protect us from harm. But here, this is not that Jesus. This is Jesus on a cross, humiliated and defeated. We like the idea of God Almighty, but what do we do with God all weak and vulnerable? The Apostle Paul calls Christ crucified a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. It's a mystery and a scandal. Why? Because it turns our whole understanding of reality upside down. Or rather, we're the ones who are upside down. And so today, I want to invite us to open our minds and consider things from a different perspective. The cross changes everything. It invites us to shift our paradigm. What if Jesus didn't come to save us from our suffering, but to change the way we view it? What if God suffered on the cross so that we could understand our own suffering? What if Jesus became weak and vulnerable to show us that being weak and vulnerable isn't bad or wrong, but can actually be the way to something powerful and profound? Let me explain. From our worldly perspective, strength and power are good. Weakness and suffering are bad. I don't need to explain that. We just naturally get it. The world we live in is all about being strong and winning. Why? Because we're afraid. We're afraid of being weak. We are driven by fear that we are not safe or valuable or loved, so we seek power, strength, and victory. Fear leads us to being competitive, judgmental, and exclusive. Left unchecked, it leads to violence, oppression, and greed. But is that the way things are supposed to be? Is that the way we're supposed to be? Is that the way God is? What if Jesus did leap off the cross and punch his way through a few dozen centurions? What if instead of shouting, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" he shouted, "I'm the Son of God. You want to mess with me?" Would you feel safe with a Jesus like that? If this were the Jesus we followed, we would be left with nothing holy or different from the way of the world. We would be left with nothing but the same old game of winning and fighting to be right. But Jesus is the game changer. When Jesus hung on the cross, he was up to something no one could see coming. And often, we miss it too. He didn't come to fight and win the way we'd expect him to. Rather, he came to love. Instead of being strong, he became weak and wounded for us, so that we might know that it's okay to be weak and wounded. Instead of being tough, he became vulnerable, so that we would not have to be afraid. Instead of defeating his enemies, he loved his enemies. He suffered and laid down his life so that we might understand what love looks like. Power and strength are useful when you're trying to win and dominate, but not very helpful when you're trying to love. When my wife Alice and I are in an argument, my natural instinct is to want to win. I want to prove I'm right. I want to defeat her with my well-reasoned arguments. But somehow, it almost never works out that way. The reality is, as long as we're playing that game, we almost always both lose. We lose in love and trust and safety in our relationship. But do you want to know what really works? Saying, I'm sorry. Or, I'm hurt. Or, I was wrong. I messed up. I made a mistake. It's crazy, but weakness and vulnerability are incredibly powerful. They lead to something far better than winning. Weakness and vulnerability make it possible to love. So, if you want to win, then go ahead and fight. Pretend you're self-sufficient and strong and that you don't need anybody. Don't let anyone see you with your guard down. You may win the world, but you will find yourself all alone. But if you want to love, then the only way is to be vulnerable, to embrace and share your weakness. Coming unarmed is the only way you can invite anyone to let down their defenses and come near to you. And so that's what Jesus did. His goal was love, from beginning to end. If you are driven by the need to win and be right, you're doing it wrong. The only way to love is through vulnerability and weakness. But the only way to learn vulnerability and weakness is through pain and suffering. This is the profound truth the cross teaches us. Because we live in a broken and sinful world full of broken and sinful people, pain and suffering are inevitable. But they don't have to be meaningless. The worldly way of strength and winning has no way of processing pain other than to deny it or try to defeat it or to cast blame. But the way of Jesus gives us the power to hold our pain with hope and transform our suffering into a capacity for love and compassion. During the time when I felt like God left me alone, I felt lost in darkness. I felt wounded, abandoned, and insecure. As a result, I searched for any way to fill that emptiness, which led me to all kinds of struggles and sin. And now I may not struggle the same way or with those same exact sins today, but I still struggle and I still sin. But my sins and struggles don't disqualify me from God's love. They make me weak and vulnerable enough to need Him and receive Him in the first place. What other way to receive grace is there? Because grace is a free gift, we can never earn it or deserve it. Therefore, insomuch as we hold on to the illusion that we are strong and good on our own, or insomuch as we think we are right and righteous, we can never grasp the love of God. It's a mystery, but God doesn't just save us from our sin and suffering. He saves us through them. Because of all the times I've been weak and wrong, I'm continuing to learn humility. Because of all the times I've experienced being vulnerable and in need, I'm continuing to learn how to trust and depend on God and to risk trusting and depending on others. Because I know what it's like to feel alone and empty, to be in darkness, to be angry, to be wounded. Because I've wandered away from God, I can have compassion for others who may be hurting or who have lost their way. There are some lessons that can only be learned through pain and suffering. In fact, throughout the scriptures, we see that pain and suffering are an essential path to all spiritual growth and deepening. When I think back on the times when I've matured the most, they've coincided with the times when I've experienced loss, pain, or failure. Why? Because often pain and suffering are the only things able to break down the illusion of my own control and self-sufficiency. Suffering has a way of getting our attention. When life inevitably brings pain and discomfort, we might cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" But what we really mean is, "Hey, what happened to my comfort and security? My God, why have you forsaken me?" Often, we only notice God when it feels like He's not there anymore. Pain and suffering can wake us up to the reality of our true need for God. They can lead us to look for Him, but the truth is, He's never left. He's been there the whole time and always will be. To all of us who have ever wondered, "God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me?" Here is God's answer. Instead of coming to fix or help us escape pain and suffering, He entered into it fully. He identified with us in our weakness. In a world of brokenness and injustice and violence and loneliness and pain, the cross is God's "Me Too," long before hashtags. He stood in solidarity with the suffering. At the cross, God became a victim. So you can know that the pain and trauma you've experienced is not your fault. What happened to you may have been bad, but it doesn't make you bad. The cross is God's ultimate affirmation of weakness and vulnerability. It's God saying, "I've been there. I understand. Jesus is called Emmanuel, which means God with us. And Jesus is God truly with us, even in our suffering, or rather, especially in our suffering, because that's the path that He chose. In our times of desperate need, in our times of abandonment and loneliness, He's there. We are not alone. God has not forsaken you. And He didn't forsake Jesus either. It's important to know that when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He wasn't being original. He was actually quoting Scripture, a psalm of King David. Psalm 22 starts with these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish?" In quoting this verse, Jesus is identifying with the depths of the human experience, but He is also saying something more. This is what scholars call a messianic psalm. It's a prophecy about the coming Messiah, the Savior. He's talking about Himself. Listen to this, starting in verse 6. "But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let Him deliver him, since He delights in him." Sound familiar? How about this? "Dogs surround me. A pack of villains encircles me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." But even in the midst of such despair, there is incredible hope. Here is the good news. For God has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden His face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. And here is the hope King David prophesied about Jesus. "All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before Him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and He rules over the nations. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim His righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, He has done it." He has done it. He led the way through suffering and pain, even death on a cross. But we know that was not the end. We know that He was not forsaken. We know that He suffered and died, but on the third day, He made His comeback. He rose from the grave and will reign over an everlasting kingdom of peace and love. So what would it look like for you to stop playing the same old game of fighting to win and be right, of pretending to be strong and self-sufficient? Instead, how might you respond to Jesus' invitation to follow Him to the cross, the way of weakness and vulnerability? The way of Jesus always means more humility and gentleness, more acceptance and compassion, more generosity and kindness. Where and with whom might God be inviting you to lay down your life and practice the sacrificial love of Jesus? Maybe some of you are in the midst of pain and suffering right now. or from the past that has yet to heal. You are not alone. He has not forsaken you. Jesus is with you in your suffering and has the power to redeem that pain and will one day deliver you from it. That is the hope we all have in the cross. May we continue to cling to that hope and be changed by the love of Jesus. May we not fear being vulnerable with one another, and may our church be a place that is safe for the weak and wounded. Amen.